Hi everyone, welcome back to AWS Daily Series Day 5. And today we are going to learn one of the most popular AWS services, that is AWS Lambda. But before we jump into Lambda, let me ask you something. Suppose you have developed .NET API, Python script, or maybe Java application. Now the application is ready. What's the next step? Well, you need to run it somewhere, right? Traditionally, you would launch a server, then you deploy your application there. Then you keep an eye on it to make sure everything is working properly. And that's where a lot of the effort goes. You have to think about the server, update, maintenance, scaling, and many other things besides your actual code. Now, imagine this. What if you could simply upload your code and click run? And what if AWS took care of all the servers behind the scenes for you? You don't have to manage infrastructure, you don't have to worry about server maintenance, and you don't even have to think about the scaling. You just write the code and AWS runs it whenever it's needed. Sounds amazing, right? Well, that's exactly what AWS does. So, what exactly is AWS Lambda? Well, AWS Lambda is a service that allows you to run your code without worrying about the servers behind it. Now, when people hear the word serverless, they often get confused. They think, does it mean there are no servers? No, not at all. The servers are still there, your code still runs on server. The only difference is that AWS handles those servers for you behind the scenes. You don't have to create them, you don't have to maintain them, and you don't have to worry about scaling them. As developers, our job becomes much simpler. We just write the code, upload it to Lambda, and AWS takes care of the rest. Okay, that's why AWS Lambda is called as a serverless service. Not just because servers don't exist, but because you don't have to manage them. Now you might be wondering, when does AWS Lambda actually run? That's a great question. The answer is very simple. Lambda doesn't keep running all the time like traditional server. Instead, it runs only when something happens. In AWS, we call that an event. Let me give you a few examples. Suppose someone uploads a file into an S3 bucket. Lambda can automatically start running, or maybe user sends a request to your API. That request can also trigger Lambda function. And if message arrives in an SKS queue, again Lambda processes it automatically. So even changes in the database or scheduled tasks can trigger Lambda. So instead of running continuously and waiting for work, Lambda simply waits for an event. When the event happens, Lambda wakes up and it will run your code and it will finishes the task. So that's why Lambda is also known as event-driven service. Let's make it even easier with real-world example. Imagine you have a website where users can upload their profile picture. Now, whenever users uploads an image, you want to create a smaller version of that image automatically. So, how do we make that happen? Here is the flow. The users uploads a photo into an Amazon S3 bucket. The moment that upload happens, AWS Lambda gets notified. Lambda immediately starts running your image processing code. Your code resizes the image and creates a smaller version. And once it is done, the resized image is saved back to S3. And that's it. The user simply uploads a picture and everything else happens automatically in the background. There will be no servers to set up and no servers to monitor and no need to manually run any process. AWS Lambda takes care of the entire workflow for you. And this is one of the reasons why AWS Lambda is so popular in modern cloud applications. Now, let's take a look at what actually happens behind the scenes when Lambda runs. Don't worry, it's much simpler than it sounds. Imagine a user does something like uploading a file or clicking a button or sending a request to an application. The moment that action happens, an event is generated. Okay, AWS detects that event and it will trigger Lambda function. And Lambda function then starts running the code that you have written. Once that code finishes its job, Lambda either returns a response or performs the required action. And that's all. If we simplify the entire process, it look like this. An event happens, Then Lambda gets triggered and your code runs, and then the task gets completed. So, this event driven approach is what makes AWS Lambda so powerful and efficient. Now that we understand how Lambda works, let's look at some of the most common ways Lambda gets triggered. The first and probably the most popular one is Amazon S3. Imagine someone uploads a file into an S3 bucket. The moment that upload happens, Lambda can start running automatically. And the same thing can happen when a file is deleted or modified. Another very common trigger is API gateway. Let's say user opens your application and clicks a button that sends a request. API gateway receives that request and can immediately trigger a Lambda function. In fact, this is how many modern serverless APIs are built. Lambda also works really well with DynamoDB. Whenever data is added, updated, or deleted in DynamoDB table, Lambda can react to those changes automatically. Now, think about queue-based applications. If a new message arrives in an SQS queue, Lambda can pick up that message and process it without any manual effort. And what if you want a task that needs to run on a schedule, maybe every day at 9 a.m. or every night at midnight? For that, AWS Event Bridge can trigger Lambda automatically based on a schedule. So, whether it's a file upload, an API request, database change, or a queue message or a scheduled task, Lambda can respond to all these events automatically. So, that's what makes Lambda so flexible and powerful. Now, you might be wondering, why do so many companies use AWS Lambda? Well, there are several reasons, but let's look at one of the biggest one. The first reason is simplicity. With Lambda, you don't have to manage any servers. So, you don't have to worry about operating system, server maintenance, security patching, or infrastructure management. AWS takes care of all of that for you. As a developer, you can spend more time on building applications and less time on managing servers. Another major advantage is automatic scaling. Let's say only one user is using your application. Lambda will run only what's needed for that one request. Now imagine your application suddenly become popular and 10,000 users start using at the same time. Normally, you'd have to add more servers and plan for the traffic. But with Lambda, AWS automatically handles that scaling for you. Whether it's a one request or thousands of requests happening simultaneously, Lambda adjusts automatically in the background. You don't need to manually increase or manage additional infrastructure. And that's one of the biggest reasons companies love AWS Lambda. Now, let's talk about another reason why companies love AWS Lambda, that is cost saving. Think about a traditional server running on EC2. Even if nobody is using your application, that server is still running. And because it's running, you're still paying for it. Now, compare that with Lambda. Lambda charges you only when your code actually executes. If no one is using your application and your code is not running, so there is no compute cost for that time. So instead of paying for ideal servers, you're paying only for actual usage. And that's what makes Lambda a very cost effective option for many applications. Another great benefit is reliability. When you deploy your code to Lambda, AWS takes care of running it on its highly available infrastructure. So you don't have to worry about setting up redundancy or handling server failures yourself. AWS manages all of that behind the scenes, helping your application to stay reliable and fault tolerant. And there is one more thing that makes AWS Lambda really powerful. That is, it integrates seamlessly with many AWS services, whether it is S3, API Gateway, DynamoDB, SQS, Event Bridge, or many others. Connecting these services with Lambda is very straightforward, and that's why Lambda is often the best choice when building modern event driven applications on AWS. You write the code, connect the services, and AWS handles the rest. Now that we understand the benefits of Lambda, let's look at where it is actually used in the real world. You might be surprised to know that Lambda is working behind the scenes in many applications that we use every day. For example, let's say a user uploads a file, Lambda can automatically process that file. Or when you need to build an API without managing servers, Lambda can handle that too. or when you want to send an email, SMS, or notifications when something happens, Lambda can trigger those actions immediately. And many companies also use Lambda to transform data, process records, and to move information between different systems. And what about the task that needs to run at a specific time every day? Things like generating reports, cleaning up old data, or running scheduled jobs can also be handled by Lambda. And it is also widely used for automation as well. That means whenever an event occurs, Lambda can respond and perform the required actions without any human intervention. And also in applications that need to react instantly to an event, Lambda is often used for real-time processing as well. So, whether it's a file processing, APIs notification, data transformation, scheduled task, automation, or real time event handling, AWS Lambda can handle everything. In fact, many modern cloud applications rely on AWS Lambda behind the scenes to make these processes work automatically and efficiently. Now, before we wrap up, here is a very common interview question, that is, what is AWS Lambda? If you're asked in an interview, you can give a simple answer like this: AWS Lambda is a serverless compute service that runs your code in response to events without requiring to manage servers. But if that sounds a bit technical, don't worry. Let's make it even simpler. AWS Lambda allows you to run your code automatically whenever something happens, such as file upload, an API request, or database update. And the best part, you don't have to create, manage, or maintain any servers. AWS handles all of that for you. So, if I had to explain AWS Lambda in one single line, I would say AWS Lambda lets you to run your code automatically whenever an event occurs without provisioning or managing servers. And that's the core idea behind AWS Lambda. Alright everyone, that's all for today. In the next video, we'll learn another important AWS service. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to HarshiLearn. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep learning and have a great day.